We are quickly approaching the 6-year anniversary of Avengers Endgame releasing in theaters, which is absolutely crazy to say out loud. I cannot believe it's been that long. We've had a lot of MCU movies released in that time. Sadly, a lot of them have been very mediocre, and making this list made me realize just how painful the MCU is to watch for the most part nowadays, so we gotta rank all of them from worst to best. In last place is the Eternals. Listen, I admire that they try to do something very different from their usual MCU tone and go for a more serious movie, but I'm sorry, this was one of the most boring films I've ever seen in my life. I don't think I've ever checked my watch as many times as when I was watching this film. I could not believe how long this film felt. It really simply comes down to the fact that there's way too many brand new characters in this movie, and we're expected to care about all of them, but I end up caring about none of them because the movie spread itself way too thin, and there's just not enough time to develop any of these characters. They're all so boring. I really think this could have thrived as a TV series if it was like 10 episodes focusing on all these different characters over time. At number 12 is Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. It's only not last place because I do just love Paul Rudd as his character, and I think he's trying his best in this movie even though the script is just so terrible, and I think the stuff between Janet and King is actually pretty interesting. Everything else you can just throw away. It would have been so easy to make a third Ant-Man movie just as good or better than the first two, but we completely get rid of the ex-cons. We take them out of their regular environment, throw them in the quantum realm, which is just absolute nothingness. It looks horrible. Every character down there is just so boring. Don't even get me started on the lame ending of this movie either, with Kang getting overran by ants and the MODOK scenes. Oh my god, this movie was just such a disappointment. At number 11, I have The Marvels. There's nothing inherently terrible about this film outside of like the singing planet, which was just absolutely unnecessary. The problem is there's also nothing really good or memorable about this film at all. It's one of the most forgettable superhero movies I've ever seen in my life. I guarantee most of you watching this have probably seen this movie. I dare you to try to think about what was the plot of this film, what was the villain's motivation, or any single thing from this film, and if you haven't watched it within like the last week, you probably can't remember. I do think the dynamic between the three Marvels was actually pretty fun. Some of the banter between them was actually pretty funny, but I do think it was a mistake to introduce a character from the WandaVision TV show, although I know she was a kid in the first Captain Marvel movie, and Miss Marvel from her TV show in the sequel to Captain Marvel. I feel like it really just alienated a lot of the audience, and it was a reason why this was such a box office flop. At number 10 is Thor: Love and Thunder. This movie has a couple redeeming qualities, which is why it's above the other ones on this list. Firstly, I do think the storyline with Jane and her cancer, the emotional moments of that do actually work decently well. It's just that they're immediately canceled out by the unfunniest joke you've ever heard in your life. And yeah, this movie throws way more jokes at the wall than it ever should, and 99% of them are not funny. Another reason this is higher than the other films on the list is because Gore the God Butcher is absolutely incredible. Every time he's on screen, which isn't enough, the film feels completely different in tone. I wish the entire movie had this more serious tone. Simply an example of Taika Waititi seeing that people like the humor in Thor Ragnarok and going way too far with it in this film, and it really was just a mistake. I honestly kind of wish the Guardians stayed with Thor in this movie and had an adventure together. At number 9, I know this is kind of a hot take, I have Spider-Man Far From Home. I'm sorry, I've rewatched this film a couple times since seeing it for the first time on release, and every time it kind of gets worse for me. I feel like this is just a nothing burger of a movie. Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio is good, and I absolutely adore his Mysterio dream illusion sequences in this movie, but trying to play him up as like the twist hero that actually ended up being a villain was such a weird choice since he's such an iconically famous villain from the comics. The tone and jokes made in this movie also kind of end up making it feel like a Disney Channel original film from like 10 years ago more so than an MCU movie. It really has some painfully unfunny humor in it, I'm not gonna lie, and the entire like big drone sequence at the end is just such a not Spider-Man big final. I'm not saying having Spider-Man outside of New York can't have interesting stories, but in this one it definitely was a mistake. At number 8 is a definite jump up in quality. Nothing amazing here, but Black Widow is at least a fine, perfectly enjoyable MCU movie, although it does definitely have its downfalls, which all pretty much stem from Dreykov and this version of Taskmaster being absolutely terrible villains in the film, but outside of these two, the film is perfectly fine. David Harbour as the Red Guardian is legitimately a lot of fun in this movie, and I really love his relationship with Natasha and Yelena in this film, and that's another positive. Everything with Yelena is amazing in this movie, although sadly I feel like she kind of overshadows Black Widow in her own film. We definitely should have just gotten a Black Widow film before Endgame when she was dead. At number 7, I have Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, another kind of just fine MCU entry. There's nothing, again, really bad about this film, and some pretty decent elements. Like Shuri, I actually thought did a really good job at taking on the Black Panther mantle, because I was super annoyed by her character in the first Black Panther movie in Infinity War, but she was definitely improved in this film. Nowhere close to Chadwick's performance, but still a solid take on the character. I do think Namor was a solid villain or kind of antagonist in in this movie, and obviously Angela Bassett was incredible. She definitely should have won the Oscar for this role over Jamie Lee Curtis. Fight me, I don't care. I genuinely think this movie is just as good as it could have been without having Chadwick, obviously with the tragic circumstances of his passing that obviously threw a huge curveball into the plot of this movie. I think they did a pretty solid job trying to overcome it though. And number 6 is Multiverse of Madness. This movie is really messy. I think the highs are higher than Wakanda Forever, but the lows are definitely lower. The highs are easily Wanda. She is the best part of this movie, and I think one of my favorite MCU villains overall. Elizabeth Olsen is truly a great actor, and she proved it in this movie. I also really like how unapologetically this is a Sam Raimi movie. His style is all over the scene, and like the music, no fight scenes and stuff are really cool. Not gonna lie, I'm not the biggest fan of Doctor Strange himself in this film, or honestly anything ever since Endgame. Like him in Spider-Man No Way Home, whatever they've done to his character and his personality, I just really don't like it anymore. The humor feels off. Same kind of goes for America Chavez. Her humor gets really old really fast. I think the multiversal stuff actually works pretty well with like the Illuminati and stuff. I just am a little bit sad that this movie abandoned the plotline set up in the post-credit scene of the first Doctor Strange with Mordo wanting to kill all sorcerers, but this movie is perfectly enjoyable and really elevated by a great Elizabeth Olsen performance. At number 5, put down your pitchforks. I know this is a flaming hot take apparently, but I have Captain America Brave New World. I think this is simply a more competent and enjoyable film than a lot of the other movies on this list, and it simply comes down to a few things. Yes, the plot is kind of messy and it's trying to be Winter Soldier and Civil War so hard and kind of failing in a lot of respects. Even though it's not up to the standard of those other Captain America movies, it does a solid job at making a new political intrigue, and ultimately I really enjoy Sam Wilson as Captain America in the MCU. This movie made me realize like I think he is genuinely a great new take on the character, and I'm super excited. I hope he gets another solo film. I also really loved Harrison Ford as Ross in this movie. I think he honestly might be the most interesting character in the movie. Everything between him and his daughter, all the stuff he's trying to do politically, and that first Red Hulk transformation is legitimately great. I think people just went in with expectations that we were just going to see Red Hulk jumping around this entire film because of how much he's in the trailers, and they were mad when he didn't get revealed until a lot later in the film. It's far from a perfect movie, but I simply had a lot of fun with this, and maybe it's just because of all these other mediocre films we've gotten on the list that I was just like, oh, finally something I kind of had fun with. Number 4 is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Easily some of the best, if not the very best, fight scenes in the entire MCU. The hand-to-hand combat is absolutely electric in this film. I do really like Shang-Chi as a character too. It's a shame we never got a sequel to this before we see him in the next Avengers film. Honestly, if the third act was anything besides a huge giant CGI dragon swooping in and Awkwafina's character wasn't in the movie, this would be honestly probably number 2. But because of those things that really take away from this movie, I have to have it a little bit lower, but still easily one of the way better and more consistent MCU movies all throughout. Everything between Shang-Chi and his dad is really powerful. At number 3 is Deadpool and Wolverine. I'm sorry, this movie was simply too much fun. The humor, yes, it's incredibly stupid, but I was laughing so much throughout this movie. The most I've laughed at an MCU film in a very long time, or honestly just any movie in theaters. Is this film absolutely packed with cameos, nostalgia bait, and fan service? Yes, but I'm sorry, I'm a huge fan of Marvel movies. It was so cool to see these characters again, and I actually think they do a good job at making them all have their own very cool side storylines, so they're not just cheap cameos. They actually have stuff to do in the movie. At number 2, honestly very close to being surpassed by Deadpool and Wolverine for me, but right now I have this ahead is Spider-Man No Way Home. It's only a debate because I think the first hour of this movie is legitimately pretty bad. Everything with Doctor Strange is pretty cringeworthy. While this movie will never reach the highs of that first time watching it in theaters, the second half of this film is still an absolute blast. Willem Dafoe as a Green Goblin is still tremendous to this day. One of the best MCU villain performances. And it's still cool even after rewatches seeing Toby and Andrew and all of them fighting together at the very end. So even though it's far from a perfect movie, it still has so many elements that I really love. That's why it's at number 2. Be sure to let me know your list in the comments below, and if you haven't, hit that like button before I give you my number 1 pick, which is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. This movie is a near masterpiece. James Gunn truly understands these characters. He was thrown a huge curveball with Gamora literally dying and coming back as a past version in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, and he handled it so perfectly. The humor and soundtrack is just as great as the first 2 Guardians movies, but where this movie really thrives over those 2 in my opinion is the emotional elements. Everything with Rocket, I just rewatched this film. It was bringing me almost to tears like multiple times. It's just really powerful stuff. I'd really appreciate it if you tap the playlist above my head right now, full of Marvel videos like my reviews for Captain America Brave New World and Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, other rankings, the Thunderbolt Fantastic Four trailer, so much is in there.